The thing about heat that most people in 1887 did not understand, and that most people today still do not understand, is that heat does not rise. Hot air rises. Heat itself moves in every direction equally, conducted through any solid material that will carry it, and the best carriers of heat are not wood and not air, but stone and earth, which absorb thermal energy slowly, hold it for hours, and release it with the patience of a thing that has been doing its job since the planet cooled. A stone floor that has been heated from below will radiate warmth upward into a room for 12 hours after the heat source is removed. A stone wall that has been heated from behind will radiate warmth forward for 8. And a cabin built entirely of stone and earth, heated not from within but from beneath, will maintain a temperature that has nothing to do with the fire that caused it, and everything to do with the mass that holds it. Elsa Rask understood this because she had grown up with it. She was born in Dalarna province in central Sweden in 1858, the daughter of a charcoal burner who heated his home with a kakelun, a Swedish tile stove that burned a small fire for 2 hours and then radiated heat from its massive ceramic body for 20. But before the kakelun, her grandmother had told her, the old houses in the north had used something simpler, a fire pit outside the house, connected to stone channels beneath the floor, the smoke and heat traveling under the living space and warming it from below the way the earth warms a root cellar from every side. The floor became the stove. The house had no chimney because the chimney was underground. The fire had no hearth because the hearth was outside. Elsa brought this knowledge to Minnesota in 1881 when she emigrated with her husband Carl, who died of typhoid in Duluth before they reached their claim. She was 23. She continued west alone, filing on a quarter section of prairie land in Otter Tail County under the Homestead Act. 160 acres of grass and sky and wind that produced wheat in summer and savage cold in winter, cold that arrived in November and did not leave until April, cold that killed the unprepared and exhausted the prepared and tested everyone in between. She built a sod house the first year, as everyone did, and she lived in it for 5 years, as everyone did, and she hated it for 5 years, as everyone did. The dirt falling from the ceiling, the damp in the walls, the insects in the sod, the darkness, the smell, and the brutal inefficiency of heating a structure whose walls were 3 feet thick, but whose R value was half that of a properly built wood cabin, because sod conducts heat faster than it insulates against it. She was 28 years old and 5 feet 4 inches tall, with wheat blonde hair that she wore in a tight knot at the base of her skull. Blue-gray eyes the color of a winter sky an hour before snowfall, a square jaw that she clenched when she was working and relaxed when she was thinking, a wide mouth that smiled rarely and meant it when it did, and hands that were too large for her frame. The hands of a woman who had been splitting wood and hauling water since she was 9. She wore a gray wool dress, a leather belt cinched at her waist, a canvas coat lined with rabbit fur that she had sewn herself, and boots that she had resoled with cowhide so many times that the original leather was a memory. She was not beautiful in the way that word was used in 1887, but she was noticeable, the kind of woman that people looked at twice, not because of her face, but because of the way she moved through a space, with the economy of someone who had calculated the energy cost of every action and eliminated the ones that did not pay. In the spring of 1887, Elsa began building a cabin to replace the sod house, and the cabin she built had no fireplace, no stove, and no chimney. This is not an exaggeration, And it is not a metaphor. The cabin had no interior heating source of any kind. The neighbors, when they learned this, and they learned it quickly because the prairie has no secrets, said she had lost her mind to the winters, which was a common enough diagnosis in Otter Tail County, and not always wrong. If you want to know what a Swedish widow built on the Minnesota prairie that stayed warm at 35 below without a single flame burning inside it, subscribe to The Warm Floor and tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. The site she chose was a low rise on the southwest corner of her quarter section. A gentle hill, perhaps 8 feet above the surrounding prairie, with a south-facing slope that caught the full arc of the winter sun from southeast to southwest. She dug into the north side of this hill, excavating a rectangular pit 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 4 feet deep into the heavy clay soil. The pit was the foundation. 3 sides, north, east, and west, were solid clay walls backed by the mass of the hill. Only the south side was open, facing the low winter sun. The floor of the pit was where the secret lived. Elsa laid a network of stone channels across the floor. Flat limestone slabs set on edge to form rectangular tunnels 6 inches wide and 8 inches tall, running in parallel rows from north to south across the full 16-foot length of the pit. She laid 7 channels, spaced 18 inches apart, covering the entire floor area. The channels connected at the south end to a single intake tunnel that ran under the south wall and continued outside the cabin for 12 feet to a stone-lined fire pit dug into the hillside. At the north end, the channels connected to a single exhaust tunnel that rose through the north wall and vented through a low stone chimney hidden in the hillside behind the cabin. The fire pit was outside. It was a stone-lined box 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 4 feet long, dug into the south slope of the hill, 12 feet from the cabin's south wall, connected to the underfloor channels by the intake tunnel. The pit had a heavy flat stone lid that could be propped open for fueling and closed to control airflow. When a fire burned in the pit, the hot smoke and gases traveled through the intake tunnel, entered the underfloor channels at the south end, passed through all 7 parallel channels across the full length of the cabin, and exited through the exhaust tunnel and chimney at the north end. The floor above the channels was 2 layers of flat limestone slabs. The first layer lay directly on top of the channel walls, creating the ceiling of the tunnels, and the second layer laid on top of the first, with a thin bed of clay mortar between them, creating a continuous stone floor 4 inches thick. The total mass of the floor, the channel walls, the 2 slab layers, and the mortar was approximately 9,000 pounds of limestone. 9,000 pounds of stone that absorbed the heat from the smoke passing beneath it, stored that heat in its crystalline structure, and radiated it upward into the cabin with the slow, steady patience of a material that does not know how to hurry. The walls rose from the pit edges, double walls of hand-hewn pine logs, the inner wall and the outer wall separated by a 6-inch gap filled with dried marsh grass for insulation. The south wall was different. It had 2 windows made of double-layered oiled deerskin stretched over frames, the 2 layers separated by a 1-inch air gap that created a primitive but effective insulating glass effect while still admitting the pale winter light. The roof was sod over poles, the only concession to conventional prairie construction, but it was 12 inches thick rather than the standard 6, and the sod was laid on a base of birch bark that waterproofed it. The combined insulation value of the double walls, the earth-backed north and side walls, the thick sod roof, and the double-layered windows created a structure that lost heat at approximately 1/4 the rate of a conventional single-wall cabin. This mattered because the underfloor system did not produce heat quickly. It produced heat slowly, steadily, and in enormous quantity stored in 9,000 pounds of stone, and a cabin that lost heat slowly was the only kind of cabin that could stay warm on stored heat alone. The door was on the south side, a single heavy plank door, hung tight, with a wool blanket nailed across the inside for additional insulation. There was no north door. There was no back entrance. The cabin presented one opening to the world, and that opening faced the sun. And everything about the structure was designed around this single principle. Heat enters from below and from the south, and the cabin's job is to hold it. The total cost of the cabin was $14. $11 for the window frames, hardware, and iron chimney cap, and $3 for the tools she had to borrow or rent that she did not already own. The stone was free, gathered from a glacial deposit 2 miles north. The logs were free, cut from the riverbank timber along the Otter Tail River. The marsh grass was free, harvested from the slough at the bottom of her quarter section. The labor was her own, performed over 4 months from April to July, working alone except for 2 days when a neighbor named Gunnar Holm helped her set the roof poles because they were too heavy for one person to lift. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to share it and subscribe to The Warm Floor, because stories like these deserve to be remembered. The first test came in October. Elsa lit a fire in the external pit at 5 in the afternoon, burning a mix of twisted prairie grass and split cottonwood, approximately 15 pounds of fuel, the amount that would have heated a conventional cabin for perhaps 2 hours. She closed the stone lid to control the burn, leaving a 6-inch gap for air intake, and the fire burned slowly for 3 hours, the smoke drawn through the intake tunnel and under the floor by the natural draft created by the temperature difference between the hot pit and the cool chimney vent. She sat inside the cabin while the fire burned outside and felt the floor change. It did not happen quickly, not the sudden blast of a stove or the sharp wave of a fireplace. It happened the way dawn happens, gradually, steadily, the stone warming degree by degree until the surface temperature of the floor rose from the ambient 45 degrees to 62 degrees over the course of 3 hours. She put her hand flat on the stone and felt the warmth radiating upward from 9,000 pounds of heated limestone, and she kept her hand there for a long time because the warmth was not just temperature. It was the warmth of a thing she had known as a child and had carried across an ocean and a continent and 5 years of sod house misery, and was now feeling again for the first time since Dalarna. By 8 in the evening, the fire in the external pit had burned to coals. Elsa closed the stone lid completely, sealing the pit. No more fuel, no more fire. The smoke cleared from the channels within 20 minutes, drawn out by the residual draft, and the floor continued to radiate. At 10 o'clock, 2 hours after the fire died, the floor surface temperature was 59 degrees. At midnight, 4 hours, it was 56. At 6 in the morning, 10 hours after the fire died, with no fuel burning anywhere, the floor surface was 51 degrees, and the air temperature inside the cabin was 48 degrees. Outside, it was 29 degrees. A 19-degree difference maintained by nothing but the thermal memory of stone that had been warm and was not yet cold. The numbers improved as the stone mass seasoned. After 2 weeks of daily fires, 1 fire per day, 15 pounds of fuel, 3 hours of burn time, the floor's baseline temperature stopped returning to ambient and instead held at 50 degrees even before the daily fire. The mass had accumulated heat faster than it could release it, and the floor had reached thermal equilibrium, a state in which the stone maintained its warmth the way a lake maintains its level, losing heat to the room at the same rate it gained heat from the daily fire, the temperature stable, the system self-regulating, the cabin warm without any fire burning inside it at any hour of any day. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button right now. It is free, takes a second, and helps the warm floor reach more people who need to hear it. Now, back to the story. The neighbors began to talk in November, when the first hard freeze hit Ottertail County, and the Prairie temperature dropped to 8 degrees, and every cabin in the settlement fired its stove, and every chimney smoked, and every household began the winter calculation. How much wood, how many hours, how cold tonight will the fire last? That was the central arithmetic of frontier life from November to April. Elsa's cabin did not smoke. Elsa's cabin had no chimney visible from the settlement side. Elsa's cabin, as far as anyone could see, was an unheated box on a hill, and the woman who lived in it was either dead or crazy, or had moved into someone else's house without telling anyone. Gunnar Holm, the neighbor who had helped with the roof poles, rode over on the 14th of November to check on her. He expected to find the cabin abandoned or the woman frozen. He found Elsa sitting at a small table near the south window, mending a shirt in a room that was 54 degrees. There was no fire, there was no stove, there was no smoke, no ash, no firewood stacked beside a hearth. The room was simply warm. Warm the way a room is warm in September. Warm for no visible reason. Warm in a way that Gunnar could not explain, and that frightened him slightly, because warmth without fire was not a thing that existed in his experience of the world. "Where is your stove?" Gunnar asked. "I don't have one," Elsa said. "Where is your fire?" "Outside," she showed him. She took him out the south door and down the slope to the fire pit, which was cold. She had not lit it since the previous afternoon. She lifted the stone lid and showed him the intake tunnel disappearing under the cabin wall. She took him back inside and had him put his hand on the floor. The stone was warm. Not hot, not fire warm, but warm the way skin is warm. A steady living heat that came from below and filled the room without source or direction. Gunnar told his wife Maren. Maren told the settlement. And within a week, the cabin on the hill was the subject of the same debate that every frontier innovation generates. She was clever, she was lucky, she was crazy, she would freeze, she would suffocate, the floor would crack, the channels would clog. And in any case, it could not possibly work in January when the real cold came and the Prairie showed you what it thought of your ideas. The assessment was delivered most confidently by Niels Berggren, who owned the general store in Fergus Falls, and who had sold more stoves than any merchant in the county, and who had a professional interest in the continued necessity of stoves. "You cannot heat a house from outside," Niels said. "The heat will be lost in the ground before it reaches the floor. She will be burning twice the wood for half the warmth. And by January, she will be in my store buying a stove like everyone else." Niels was wrong. January came, and with it, the cold, the real cold, the Minnesota cold, the cold that killed livestock and froze wells and turned the prairie into a white plain under a white sky, where the only color was the black of chimney smoke rising straight up in the still frozen air. On the 22nd of January, the temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero and stayed there for 3 days. Elsa burned 2 fires per day during the cold snap, morning and evening, 15 pounds of fuel each, the same twisted grass and split cottonwood she had been burning all winter. Total daily fuel consumption, 30 pounds. Her neighbor Gunnar, heating a conventional cabin of similar size with a cast iron stove, burned approximately 120 pounds of wood per day during the same period, 4 times the fuel for a cabin that was, by Gunnar's own measurement, 12 degrees colder than Elsa's. The floor held. The 9,000 pounds of limestone, heated twice daily for 3 months, had accumulated so much thermal energy that the cold snap could not drain it faster than the daily fires replenished it. The floor surface temperature during the 3-day freeze never dropped below 49 degrees. The air temperature inside the cabin never dropped below 46. 46 degrees at 35 below zero, maintained by 30 pounds of fuel per day and a fire that never burned inside the cabin walls. On the 3rd day, Niels Berggren rode out from Fergus Falls, not to sell a stove, but to see the cabin. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room. No stove, no chimney, no hearth, no firewood, no ash. And he put his hand on the floor and felt the warmth, and he said nothing for a long time, because Niels was a man who sold solutions, and he was standing in a room that had solved the problem without buying anything from him. "How much wood?" Niels finally asked. 30 pounds a day, Elsa said. In the worst cold, Niels calculated. His best customers burned 150 pounds a day in cold snaps. His average customers burned 80. 30 pounds was a revolution, not an improvement, but a fundamental change in the economics of survival. The kind of change that made stoves not obsolete, but optional, which from the perspective of a stove merchant was worse. Thank you for watching this story on the warm floor. If it reminded you that sometimes the warmest room has no fire in it, please share it. Subscribe for more stories from the frontier, and tell us in the comments, what would you have built? Niels did not sell Elsa a stove, but that spring he began stocking flat limestone slabs at his store in Fergus Falls, and when customers asked why, he told them about a cabin in Ottertail County that burned a quarter of the wood and stayed warmer than any house in the settlement. And he described the system, the external pit, the channels, the stone floor, with the detailed enthusiasm of a man who had realized that if he could not sell stoves, he could sell the stones that replaced them. By the autumn of 1888, 3 families in the settlement had installed underfloor channel systems in their cabins, 2 of them with Elsa's direct guidance. By 1890, the number was 9. Elsa charged nothing for her advice. She walked each site, drew the channel layout in the dirt with a stick, specified the stone thickness, and explained the draft mechanics. The fire pit must be lower than the cabin floor to create natural draw. The exhaust chimney must be at the highest point. The channels must slope slightly upward from intake to exhaust, so that condensation drains back toward the fire pit rather than pooling in the channels and blocking airflow. She lived on the quarter section for 21 years. She never rebuilt the cabin. The stone floor and the double walls and the sod roof lasted without major repair for the full duration. The stone channels never clogging because the limestone was smooth and the draft was strong, and the system was self-cleaning in the way that all well-designed systems are self-cleaning. The physics did the maintenance. She never installed a stove. She never built a fireplace. She never burned a fire inside her cabin walls. She heated her home from below, from outside, from the ground itself, using a principle that was older than Sweden and older than Minnesota and older than the frontier. The principle that stone remembers heat the way water remembers rain, slowly, faithfully, and for a long time after the source has stopped. settle back, listen carefully, and journey with us through the legends, hard truths, and enduring wisdom of the American frontier. Subscribe to The Warm Floor. The fire is warm, the night is still, and the frontier has much to teach.